In the shadow of the longships and the thunder of the gods, a new faith began to creep across the north. Not with swords and axes, but with words, with promises of eternal salvation, and with kings who sought to rule not just by might, but by divine right. This is the story of how the Vikings, feared pagans of the north, came face to face with Christianity, and how it changed their world forever. Welcome, seekers of history. Today, we journey deep into the transformation of a people, how faith, politics, and power reshaped the Viking Age. Stay with us until the very end, because what begins as a clash of gods and crosses ends with the birth of a new cultural identity that still echoes through Europe today. The Viking world was carved from frost and fire. For centuries, the Norse people honored their ancient gods, Odin the Allfather, Thor the Thunderer, Freyja, the goddess of fertility, and countless spirits of the land and sea. These gods were not distant. They were fierce, unpredictable, and woven into every storm, every harvest, every battle cry. But by the 8th and 9th centuries, as longships struck the coasts of England, Ireland, and Freyja, the Vikings encountered a new power. Not just warriors in armor, but priests carrying the sign of the cross. Not just kingdoms defended by kings, but churches defended by faith. And with each raid, each settlement, and each alliance, the Norse world grew more entangled with Christianity. At first, the encounters were brutal. Monasteries, filled with wealth but little defense, became the earliest victims. Lindisfarne, the holy island of Northumbria, fell to Viking raiders in 793. The monks recorded the terror. Heathens desecrated the house of God, shed the blood of saints, and trampled upon holy things. To the Christian chroniclers, these men from the sea were not merely foreign invaders. They were pagans, enemies of Christ. And yet, history is not so simple. For even as Vikings plundered churches, they carried home not just silver and relics, but whispers of a new world. Books filled with strange letters, tales of a single almighty God, and rituals unlike any in the halls of the Norse. Over time, this clash between pagan raiders and Christian monks shifted into something far more complex. Missionaries began to follow the paths of the longships, not with spears, but with scripture. Kings and jarls, ambitious for power, found in Christianity a new tool, one that could legitimize their rule in the eyes of Europe. And ordinary men and women, weary of bloodshed and searching for meaning, began to find solace in the message of salvation. The story of the Christianization of the Vikings is not a tale of overnight conversion. It is a saga spanning centuries, a slow weaving of old and new, where Odin's ravens still flew in the hearts of many, even as churches rose on Scandinavian soil. Let us begin with the earliest stirrings of this faith among the Northmen. The first seeds of Christianity were sown not in Scandinavia itself, but abroad. As Vikings settled in foreign lands, they came face to face with Christian societies. The Danelaw in England, for example, placed Norse settlers within reach of Anglo-Saxon churches and bishops. Here, some Vikings began to convert, not always out of belief, but out of necessity. A Christian ruler could more easily make peace, trade, and intermarry with neighboring kingdoms. One of the earliest known converts was Guthrum, the Danish warlord who clashed with Alfred the Great of Wessex. After years of bloody conflict, Guthrum was defeated and forced to negotiate peace. In 878, as part of the Treaty of Wedmore, Guthrum agreed to be baptized. Taking the Christian name Aethelstan, he became godson to Alfred himself. This was no mere ritual, it was politics, binding Viking and Saxon through the shared language of faith. But what of Scandinavia itself? In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the old gods still reigned. Temples at Uppsala, sacrifices at Lair, and sacred groves kept alive the worship of Odin, Thor, and Freyja. Missionaries entered this world cautiously, often under the protection of kings. Some were welcomed, others were slain. Ansgar, known as the Apostle of the North, stands as a symbol of this early mission. Born in 801 in Freyja, he felt called to bring Christianity to the Vikings. He traveled first to Denmark, where King Harald allowed him to preach, and then to Sweden, where he established a small church at Birka. His efforts were fragile churches burned. Converts wavered, but his persistence laid the groundwork for centuries to come. Though Ansgar died in 865, his legend lived on, and the seeds he planted would one day grow into the roots of Scandinavian Christendom. Still, resistance was strong. For the Norse, the old gods were tied not only to faith, but to identity, to the land, to the very cycle of life. To abandon Thor was to risk storms at sea. To forsake Freyja was to gamble with the harvest. Conversion was not simply a matter of prayer, it was a reshaping of an entire worldview. Kings stood at the center of this struggle. In the Viking Age, a king was not just a war leader, but a sacred figure, tied to the gods through ritual and sacrifice. For a king to embrace Christianity meant redefining his role, no longer the chosen of Odin, but the anointed of Christ. In the centuries to come, this transformation would bring both unity and bloodshed, as brothers fought brothers, and kingdoms wavered between the hammer and the cross. As the 9th century drew into the 10th, Christianity's presence in the Viking world began to grow stronger, carried not only by missionaries and monks, but also by the ambitions of kings. For rulers who sought to expand their influence, Christianity offered a powerful alliance, an entry into the vast network of Christian Europe. To be baptized was not only to kneel before a new god, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with emperors, bishops, and lords whose power stretched far beyond the fjords. Denmark became the first Scandinavian kingdom to feel the weight of this change. By the early 10th century, the kingdom was a patchwork of pagan traditions and Christian influences. The old gods still commanded loyalty, yet more and more churches appeared along the coasts. Archaeological finds, such as simple wooden crosses buried alongside Thor's hammers, reveal a world in transition. For many, faith was not an all-or-nothing choice. A man might call upon Christ for healing, yet still sacrifice to Thor before setting sail. It was King Harald Bluetooth, who reigned in the latter half of the 10th century, who pushed Denmark decisively toward Christianity. Harald, son of Gorm the Old and Queen Thyra, was a cunning leader who saw in Christianity both opportunity and necessity. Around the year 965, Harald declared that he had united all of Denmark and Norway, and that he had made the Danes Christian. This bold proclamation is carved into the great gelling stones, monumental runestones that still stand today. But the truth was more complicated. Conversion did not sweep through Denmark overnight. Many resisted, clinging fiercely to the old gods. Yet Harald understood the political power of Christianity. By aligning himself with the faith, he strengthened ties with the Holy Roman Empire and gained legitimacy in the eyes of Christian Europe. His rule stood as proof that to be a Christian king was to be part of a greater whole, no longer isolated at the edge of the world, but central to its unfolding story. Norway's path to Christianity was even bloodier. There, conversion was carried not only by preachers, but by the sword. King Håkon the Good, raised in England as a Christian foster son of King Athelstan, tried to bring the faith to his homeland in the mid-10th century. Yet his efforts met fierce resistance. When he called for the end of sacrifices to the gods, the jarls and farmers of Norway rose against him. Håkon was forced to compromise, secretly holding to his faith while outwardly maintaining pagan rites. His failure revealed the dangers of pushing Christianity too quickly upon a people still loyal to Thor and Odin. It would take another king, Olaf Tryggvason, to strike with greater force. Olaf, a warrior and adventurer who had traveled through England, Ireland, and the courts of Christian rulers, returned to Norway in 995 with a vision. He built churches, destroyed pagan temples, and baptized his followers in rivers and fjords. but Olaf's zeal was ruthless. Those who resisted were forced to choose between baptism or exile, conversion or death. Under his reign, Norway bled as the hammer and the cross clashed in open defiance. The story continued with Olaf Haraldsson, remembered as Saint Olaf, who ruled in the early 11th century. Unlike his predecessors, Olaf combined fire and faith with an enduring legacy. He saw in Christianity not only salvation, but a means to unify Norway under a single crown. He too used harsh measures, yet his vision of a Christian kingdom endured long after his death in battle at Stiklestad in 1030. To many, Olaf became a martyr, and within a year of his fall, he was canonized by the Church. His shrine at Nidaros became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe, securing Christianity's hold on Norway forever. Sweden, meanwhile, followed its own path. The land of Sphere and Goths clung longer to the old gods, especially at Uppsala, where a great temple stood as a center of pagan worship. There, every 9 years, great sacrifices were said to take place. Horses, oxen, and even humans offered to Odin, Thor, and Freyja. Missionaries faced a hostile reception, and for centuries, Christianity struggled to gain ground. Yet, by the 11th century, as trade and alliances grew, Swedish rulers began to see the advantage of embracing the cross. By the mid-12th century, Sweden too was firmly Christian, though pockets of paganism survived in the forests and mountains for generations. Throughout Scandinavia, the process of Christianization was not just a matter of royal decree. It seeped into daily life through marriage, trade, and culture. Viking merchants traveling to Christian lands encountered churches, relics, and rituals. Women, often more receptive to the new faith, played key roles in introducing Christianity into households. Burial practices began to shift. Graves once filled with weapons, ships, and offerings gradually gave way to simple interments marked with crosses. Yet the transition was never simple. For many, the old and new existed side by side. In some graves, archaeologists have found Thor's hammer amulets lying next to crosses, symbols of both faiths resting together. This blending suggests not a sudden break, but a long negotiation, where people sought to protect themselves by honoring every possible power, whether pagan or Christian. Even language bears witness to this transformation. Norse words for God, heaven, and church entered common speech, mingling with the old tongue of the sagas. Skaldic poets began to weave Christian imagery into their verses, even as they praised warriors with references to Odin's halls. Slowly, the myths of Asgard gave way to the stories of Christ, saints, and angels. But perhaps the most profound transformation lay not in rituals or words, but in power. Christianity offered a framework of authority that extended beyond the battlefield. To be a Christian king was to claim divine sanction, to rule not only by might, but by God's will. And for the church, conversion meant not only saving souls, but securing influence over vast new lands. The Christianization of the Vikings was, in truth, a bargain struck between faith and politics. Missionaries offered salvation, but kings saw crowns. Priests preached humility, but rulers embraced divine authority. And in this bargain, the Viking Age itself began to fade, giving way to the medieval kingdoms that would shape the future of Scandinavia. The spiritual transformation of the Viking world did not occur in isolation. Beyond Scandinavia, the wider currents of Europe pressed in, shaping how Norse society adapted to Christianity. The Holy Roman Empire, England, and the Christian kingdoms of France offered both a model and a challenge. For Viking rulers, embracing the faith meant recognition and respect. Rejecting it risked isolation and conflict. Trade played a subtle yet decisive role. Viking merchants traveled far and wide to the ports of England, the Frisian coast, and the monasteries along the Rhine, encountering Christian culture at every turn. They saw cities dominated by churches and cathedrals, heard the Latin chants of monks, and witnessed rulers whose authority was reinforced by their faith. Gradually, the allure of the Christian world became irresistible. To trade safely, to form alliances, and to marry into powerful families, the Norse had to engage with the religion of their neighbors. Yet, conversion was not always voluntary. In many instances, it was enforced by rulers seeking unity under one faith. In Denmark and Norway, kings mandated baptism and punished resistance. Across Sweden, local chieftains often struggled to impose Christianity on reluctant farmers and warriors. Sometimes, this tension erupted into violence. Pagan uprisings, secret sacrifices, and clandestine worship endured well into the 12th century. But faith is rarely won by force alone. The early missionaries understood that to convert a people, they had to speak to their hearts as well as their minds. They adopted a strategy of patience and adaptation, blending Christian teachings with familiar Norse concepts. The Christian God became a warrior of justice, echoing Odin's strength. Saints were portrayed as protectors, much like the old gods. In art, manuscript illumination, and sermon, the message of salvation was made accessible to the North. Women played a crucial role in this subtle transformation. Norse sagas recount the influence of queens and noblewomen who adopted Christianity and introduced it to their families. Their households became centers of prayer and learning, planting seeds of faith that kings could later cultivate on a broader scale. Through marriage alliances, the faith spread across borders, intertwining dynasties and shaping the political landscape of Northern Europe. Baptism ceremonies themselves became political theater, reinforcing the authority of kings while demonstrating the power of the church. Rivers and fjords filled with water as rulers and their followers knelt, marking a symbolic rebirth. The ritual was as much about loyalty and obedience as it was about spiritual salvation. In this way, Christianity reshaped both personal belief and the structure of society. By the 11th century, the landscape of Scandinavia had been irrevocably altered. Pagan temples fell silent or were destroyed. New churches arose in their place, often on sacred sites that once honored Odin and Thor. The very geography of faith shifted. What was once a world of groves, stones and altars became a world of stone churches, altarpieces, and parish boundaries. Yet echoes of the old beliefs persisted. Folktales, seasonal festivals, and magical charms retained elements of the Norse worldview, blending pagan and Christian traditions in a uniquely Scandinavian synthesis. The Christianization of the Vikings also had profound cultural consequences. Literacy expanded as monks introduced Latin writing, enabling the recording of laws, chronicles, and religious texts. Saga writing, previously focused on heroic deeds and genealogy, increasingly included Christian themes and moral lessons. Art and craftsmanship evolved, reflecting a fusion of pagan motifs with Christian iconography. Even burial practices became a canvas for this synthesis, as crosses appeared alongside swords and grave goods mingled with relics of faith. Yet, the transformation was not merely external. The conversion to Christianity fundamentally changed how Vikings perceived themselves and their place in the world. Warriors who once sought honor only in battle began to measure their lives by moral and spiritual codes. Kings who had ruled by might now claimed authority through divine sanction. Communities that had relied solely on kinship and tradition began to see themselves as part of a larger Christian order. This shift did not erase the past, it reinterpreted it. Old Norse myths and values were reframed in light of the new faith. Courage, loyalty, and honor remained central virtues, now harmonized with Christian teachings of humility, charity, and piety. The sagas preserved the memory of pagan deeds, but their meaning was reshaped, serving both as history and as moral instruction within a Christianized culture. In essence, the Christianization of the Vikings was a story of adaptation, negotiation, and transformation. It was a slow, uneven process that spanned generations, blending the old and the new in ways that were often messy, sometimes violent, but always profound. By the end of the 11th century, Scandinavia had largely embraced Christianity, not as a foreign imposition, but as a faith woven into the very fabric of society, politics, and culture. As Christianity took root in Scandinavia, its influence reached far beyond kings and churches. Entire communities began to feel the ripple effects of this new faith. The very rhythm of life changed, from the cycle of pagan festivals to the liturgical calendar, from the forms of law to the expression of art. Society, once structured around clan loyalty and warrior prowess, gradually absorbed the moral and ethical frameworks of Christianity. The Christianization of the Vikings also reshaped legal and social systems. Laws that had once centered primarily on honor, vengeance, and family feuds began to incorporate Christian principles. Churches became centers of mediation and judgment, offering frameworks for conflict resolution that went beyond blood revenge. Local assemblies, or things, started to include clergy in deliberations, giving spiritual weight to civil decisions. Justice, once a matter of force, began to carry moral and religious authority. Education, too, began to flourish. Monks and clerics introduced reading, writing, and Latin literacy, previously almost non-existent in Viking society. Manuscripts and texts, often religious in nature, were copied in monasteries, creating archives of knowledge that preserve both Christian teachings and glimpses of the old Norse traditions. For a society that had valued oral storytelling above all, this shift represented a profound transformation. History, law, and culture could now be recorded, interpreted, and transmitted with permanence. Christianity also altered gender dynamics. Women, who had often held significant roles in household and community rituals, found new avenues of influence within the church. Noblewomen and queens championed the faith, building churches and funding religious institutions. Monastic life offered women a path of education, spiritual leadership, and independence previously unavailable in a purely pagan society. The intersection of faith and gender subtly reshaped Scandinavian social structures, opening spaces for influence, authority, and learning that would endure for centuries. The fusion of Christian and Norse culture created a uniquely Scandinavian identity. Pagan rituals did not disappear overnight. Rather, they were often reinterpreted within a Christian framework. Festivals, seasonal rites, and folklore gradually incorporated Christian meaning, creating a syncretic culture that honored both past and present. Yule, once a celebration of the winter solstice and the gods, became intertwined with the birth of Christ. Sacred landscapes continued to inspire reverence, but crosses, churches, and chapels now dominated the spiritual horizon. Art and symbolism underwent a similar transformation. Viking artistry, known for its intricate carvings, runes, and depictions of mythological beasts, began to reflect Christian iconography. Woodwork, metalwork, and stone carvings incorporated crosses alongside dragons and serpents. The visual culture of the North evolved, demonstrating the capacity of Norse artisans to merge old and new, pagan and Christian, in ways both subtle and striking. The process of Christianization also had significant political ramifications. Kings who embraced the faith were able to form stronger alliances with European powers, gaining legitimacy, resources, and support. Diplomacy was enhanced. Trade became safer, as Christian rulers were more likely to honor agreements with fellow believers. This integration into a broader European network bolstered the stability and prosperity of emerging Scandinavian kingdoms. Yet conversion was not without tension. Pagan resistance persisted in remote areas and among conservative factions. Revolts, secret rituals, and resistance to taxation for church construction occasionally erupted. Some local leaders attempted to maintain old practices alongside Christian obligations, creating a delicate balance between tradition and faith. These conflicts revealed the deep cultural negotiations that accompanied conversion, highlighting the complexity of this transformation. Missionaries continued to play a pivotal role, offering education, spiritual guidance, and moral instruction while navigating a world still deeply rooted in pagan values. Their work often required diplomacy, persuasion, and patience. Saints' cults emerged, particularly in Norway and Denmark, linking local devotion to broader Christian networks. Pilgrimage sites, relics, and holy wells became focal points for faith, reinforcing the authority of the Church and its integration into daily life. The Christianization of the Vikings also redefined concepts of death and the afterlife. Pagan notions of Valhalla and Hell began to be replaced or at least supplemented by Christian teachings of heaven, hell, and salvation. Burial customs shifted, with the deceased increasingly interred in consecrated ground, often with simple grave markers rather than elaborate pagan offerings. This transformation reflected not only religious conversion, but also a profound change in how the Vikings understood the human soul, morality, and the eternal journey. Over time, the Christianization of the Vikings fostered a lasting legacy that extended far beyond religion. It reshaped Scandinavian politics, culture, law, and society, linking the North to the broader European world. Kings and clergy, warriors and artisans, women and commoners all participated in a complex negotiation that blended old traditions with new beliefs. The result was a distinctive Scandinavian identity rooted in the fierce heritage of the North, yet enriched and transformed by the faith of Christ. The story of the Christianization of the Vikings is ultimately a story of adaptation. A people once defined by raiding, exploration, and pagan devotion learned to navigate a new world of spiritual authority, political alliances, and cultural synthesis. The hammer and the cross coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony, shaping a civilization that would endure long after the longships had faded from the seas. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Christianization of the Vikings had transformed the North in ways that no one could have imagined a century before. Churches dominated village landscapes, monasteries became centers of learning, and bishops began to wield influence comparable to that of kings. Christianity had become not just a religion, but a framework through which power, culture, and society were organized. The Old Norse gods, once omnipresent in everyday life, had been relegated to memory and legend. Thor's hammer and Odin's runes survived in art, storytelling, and folklore, yet their role had shifted from spiritual authority to cultural heritage. Even as Christian rituals flourished, Norse myths were preserved in sagas and poems, often reinterpreted to reflect the moral and spiritual values of the new faith. This blending of old and new ensured that the Viking past was never truly lost. It was transformed, reframed, and integrated into the Christianized world. Saint Olaf of Norway exemplified this fusion of faith and leadership. His death at Stiklestad became both a martyrdom and a symbol of the unification of faith and kingdom. Pilgrims traveled from far and wide to venerate his shrine in Nidaros, strengthening the church's presence and its influence over Norway. Olaf's canonization also set a precedent. The Christianization of Scandinavia was not solely about kings forcing faith upon their subjects. It was about inspiring devotion, loyalty, and identity through the intertwining of religion and rule. The social fabric of Viking society also shifted profoundly. Education and literacy, introduced and maintained by Christian institutions, created new opportunities for clergy, nobility, and eventually commoners. The Latin alphabet opened the door to record-keeping, law codification, and chronicling history. With these tools, Scandinavian societies began to document their own stories, merging pagan memory with Christian morality, creating a rich cultural record for generations to come. Trade networks expanded as Christian identity facilitated connections with the broader European world. Merchants, protected under Christian law and custom, could travel with greater security, bringing wealth, ideas, and art back to the North. Monastic centers often acted as hubs for commerce as well as learning, intertwining spiritual life with economic activity. This integration strengthened the kingdoms politically and economically, ensuring that Christianity's influence was felt in every facet of life. Yet, conversion was more than politics and commerce. It touched the hearts and minds of the people, reshaping moral expectations, social obligations, and spiritual life. Concepts of sin, penance, and salvation introduced a new moral framework. Generosity, charity, and care for the poor became increasingly emphasized in daily life. Pagan notions of honor and courage remained, but they were now complemented by Christian virtues of humility, forgiveness, and devotion. Even festivals and seasonal celebrations were transformed. Yule and midsummer festivities, once dedicated solely to pagan deities, began to reflect Christian narratives, merging joy and ritual with the Church's teachings. Weddings, funerals, and births gradually incorporated Christian rites, linking life's milestones to faith in ways previously unknown in the Viking world. By the 13th century, Christianity had become fully established across Scandinavia. Pagan temples had largely disappeared, replaced by stone churches and cathedrals. Monks and priests guided communities in moral and spiritual matters, while kings ruled under the auspices of divine authority. Scandinavia was no longer an isolated pagan land. It was part of a Christian Europe, connected to a network of faith, politics, and culture stretching from Rome to the British Isles. The legacy of this transformation endures to this day. Modern Scandinavia carries echoes of both its Norse heritage and its Christian past. The stories of gods and heroes, once the foundation of belief, survive in literature and folklore. The cross and church dominate the spiritual landscape, while legal systems, governance, and cultural practices reflect centuries of adaptation. Christianity did not erase the Viking spirit. It transformed it, ensuring that the legacy of the North would endure in new, unexpected forms. And so, from the thunder of Odin to the solemn toll of church bells, the Vikings were transformed. Their world of longships and legends became a world of faith, law, and lasting legacy. The hammer of Thor may have faded from daily devotion, but the courage, honor, and resilience of the Norse lived on, now intertwined with the cross of Christ. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, hit that like button, share this adventure with fellow history lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the Viking Age. Comment below, what part of the Viking Christian transformation surprised you the most? We love reading your insights and continuing the discussion with our community. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because history always has more to teach us.